Great. So yeah, so this is situating language and text in public. So a presentation and then a discussion with the group on that topic. So this is the diagram that I made to explain who I am. I'm an artist primarily. I work with the themes of like language, communication, alienation, the internet, truth, community, and power, and all through the lens of the internet. So internet informed is kind of how I like to think about it. It makes most sense like that. Like it's yeah. And so that I work with a number of different mediums. I write, I perform, I research. I'm a visual artist. I'm also a designer in various spaces. So just a lot of different mediums, all handling the same kind of ideas. And quite a lot of it does come back to thinking about text and language. So this is just the description of the that I gave, that I believe that you've got. So if you wanted to read this in not my handwriting, yeah, I'm just thinking about how text changes depending on the context that it's in, and like about the materials that it's with, how it's how public it is. If it's like a shop sign or something and it's that big and it's that prominent, how does it change how we feel about it? How does it change what we expect it to mean? How does it change how we feel if it doesn't mean what we expect it to mean, and if there is a difference there? And then also thinking about how we can write in ways which are connected with the body and are connected to feeling and are appropriate for the feelings that we're trying to talk about, basically. So that's what I'd like to discuss. So I'm going to start by looking at some things that I have made, and then we'll look a little bit wider, and then we can talk about it together, if that's all good. Yeah, so this is the first piece that I'm sharing, and it was one of the first things that I made that was very public and very clearly about text, about writing. And it was a coat that I would wear like all of the time while I was a student. And one day I was like, you know what, this feels right. And so it's the word participate painted onto a coat. And it's something that so sorry, I've chosen these keywords with everything that I am talking about today, because I feel like that brings in the key points about how the text is considered in that context. So for this, I've chosen the words public, instructional, and dialogic, which means like relating to a dialogue or a conversation. Public, because when you wear this coat, you'll become a walking artwork and you engage people who look at you, basically. Instructional, because the choice of word is an instruction or a command to the reader. It's asking them to participate, which should make them think about ways in which they do or don't participate already, if it doesn't bring them into something now. And dialogic, so related to conversations. So because the text is quite provocative, it does ask you to engage, and it does ask you to come into it, basically. So this is another work that I made that revolves quite heavily around language, but also in a very specific context. And the keywords that I chose here are fragile, power, and spatial. So they're ceramic hands, and they have the word revere written across them. So it's asking you basically to like really respect these hands and their position, and the way that it's hung in the space also makes you it kind of creates that by they're above your head, so you have to look up to them. So it's creating that power dynamic. And when I was making it, I was thinking a lot about the hand of the author and the power dynamics when we're writing. Yeah, so it's fragile, it's ceramic, it's suspended with fishing wire outside, which is a very kind of, it almost creates it feels like it should be a mobile or something that they maybe would like move in the wind. And that kind of delicateness as well is something that is very present when you think about kind of the word revere, to meaning like to respect. And that's the way that text is used in this piece. So this is a more traditional work. It takes in quite a lot of non-words. So they are not real words, and they came from this Twitter bot called @non-denotative. And what it does is it takes a lot of syllables and a lot of sections of words together that sound like they should be real words, but they're not. And so I took ones from there that I liked and I put them into a painting. And I really like how it kind of elevates them. It If you see words in a painting or in a gallery, you might expect them to carry quite a lot of meaning, or just be very conceptually relevant. But in this case, it disrupts that expectation. So it creates like a sense of play and a sense of kind of chaos as well. So the keywords that I picked out here were non-words, mouthfeel, because it was so much about the syllables and about the way the words fit together, and a sense of falling apart because it's so chaotic, and it creates a sense of chaos when you realize that you don't actually understand what the words mean. So this was maybe one of my more intense pieces. So this is a performance piece that I did where I had a tattoo of some words that were not real words, and it was not a sentence with any meaning. And I had that tattooed down my back. And then in the performance, it was cleaned in the private view. So the people who came into the private view were very aware that it was a real tattoo. And it draws on pretty much all of the concepts that I've mentioned in the other work. So ask questions about the balance of power. So who decided on the words? Was it the tattooist? Do I even know what it says? I had a camera under the table which was going to a TV feed, and I was saying things that were almost the words on my back, but they weren't quite. So it was asking those questions again, like, do I even know what this means? And it meant that the audience came in, they felt like they had more power in the situation than I did, because they came in on a mezzanine level, which had the TV on it. So it was overlooking where I was doing the performance. So they could see so much more of the situation than I could. They could see the whole thing. They could see all of the words. They could see me not quite understanding the words. They could see it being clean, so they knew it was real. And it really plays on like the permanence and seriousness of tattooing. So surely something is very important if you're going to get it tattooed. But actually in this case, the sentence was completely made up. And I always think it's very funny how I got to listen to everyone tell everyone that they were sure they knew what it meant. And there were loads of old guys just being like, no, it's Latin, I know what it means. And it's like, no, you don't, it's totally made up. And so the keywords here, non-words, intense, because it really, like, the main thing at play here is a very intense relationship with the meaning of those words, which doesn't exist. And it's kind of this chasing of this meaning that doesn't exist, and also permanent, because that is a permanent tattoo and it is still on my back. Yeah. And then this is the last of my works that I'm going to share. So this is a piece called How High, and it was in the windows of our studio block. It was visible from street level, and it cast shadows as well onto the walls of our studio. So it felt like it was almost a two-way conversation, even though it was only, it was a static piece of writing, but it felt like it was in dialogue with the outside and the people outside, and also us, the people inside. And it was just to try and draw people into just being like, that's kind of funny. Like it's almost a reward for just paying attention, because the masking tape did blend in quite well with the blinds, and it was pretty subtle, but you could see it. Like I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but it is visible. It's just really quite subtle. This work honestly was quite fun to make, and it was very quick, and I really loved it, and I didn't expect to love it so much, but I think I just really liked how it had this sense of outside and inside, and how it draws you in and out. So now I'm going to look at a few other artists who use language, or signs and things similar to that. So the first one is Jenny Holzer. possibly quite an obvious choice, because I think that she's maybe one of the most famous artists that uses text in her work, but I think that her work is very powerful, and it really resonates with me, to be honest, because it's taking signage and existing infrastructure to kind of disrupt spaces where you might otherwise expect to see adverts or warnings. And then the writing itself is really quite emotional and quite sensitive. So often her statements will be about themes of power and kindness and emotional growth and quite deep and heavy sentiments. So the works really, they surprise you, I think. And I like that kind of surprise. Like, you don't expect to necessarily be like just looking at a cinema marquee and then be thinking about how tender you are. And it's really nice that it works in that way. And also I think that it's quite the words that she does use are very bodily, actually, because it brings it back to how you're feeling and how you're moving. And so there's quite a lot of almost like visceral language about the body that she uses as well. This piece here has quite a lot of quite intense language, actually. And it's always very direct. It's very in conversation with whoever is viewing at it. She uses the word you quite a lot, and makes you really connect with it, basically. So this is a more traditional, like in the gallery art context, but Cy Twombly's work, it's inspired me, honestly, quite a lot, because his paintings and drawings, they use text in a very hidden and quite unexpected way. It's almost not writing, but it does come together to very definitely kind of say that it is writing, but it's not about the fact that it's writing. So it's I've chosen the words abstracted, hidden, and gestural here, because it takes the form of writing and it breaks it down into its movements, into its like constituent parts. And I just really like how it does that. And hidden, because you don't necessarily even think of it as writing to start off with, but when you start thinking about it in a certain way, you're like, oh no, definitely that does have the language of writing. So this piece up the top left, it has this the patterns of the lines, almost like you're writing very quickly in quite a hurried way, but it doesn't, I don't think it actually says anything. I'm pretty sure it's just the gestures and the movements of language, but I think that says enough almost. I really like how it doesn't have necessarily that meaning behind it. So someone who does definitely have meaning in their work is Bruce Nauman, and it's very bold and it's confrontational. And his use of neon, I like how that reflects signage, so street signage that you would expect, and it really draws your attention in. And then the actual words themselves are quite, I'm using the word bodily again. I feel like it comes up quite a lot about the things that I really like. It's very direct and playful and honestly quite crude. Like, quite a lot of the language that he uses is quite provocative. Yeah, they're very hard to ignore pieces because they're made in this neon way, and they're reflecting street signage, which carries with it all of this language of, like, we're almost trained to look at it and we're trained to kind of get information from it, but then it's saying something unexpected again. So it's this kind of notion of the unexpected. Amy So Woo, her work it emerges from the kind of use of English words in Chinese fashion, to as like using them for their aesthetic symbolism rather than their meaning. So they're just like how here you'll find people with, like, there was a whole trend of like tattoos of characters that people don't know but they love the look of and things like that, and that in fashion, and then that's kind of reversed. So it takes that notion of steganography, which means secret writing that hides info in the public eye, to put hidden meaning into these garments that might not necessarily be understood by people who just see them. They'll just see them as like an aesthetic statement using the signifiers of English language. So it's really interesting how this only works in the context, because it wouldn't work. It wouldn't have anywhere near the same meaning in a country that was primarily English speaking, because you would just see the meaning straight away. It's almost like you would see right through what she's actually doing. So I really like how that meaning is hidden, but only in this specific context. And then the last artist that I'm going to look at is someone called Amandine Alessandra, and her work is creating language physically using the body, so using the body to make letter forms. So it writes with the movement of the people involved in a kind of almost a dance itself, and the writing that is created is very transient. It can only really be preserved using a camera. So it's very physical. It's a very physical process of writing, and it makes me think about, so what if you were writing about moving using this way of writing that was made of moving, and like how there is a really interesting potential there, I feel like, for having something that is totally unalienated from what it actually is, but also it's still writing, which I think is kind of a problem that I find myself facing a lot when I'm dealing with language, when I'm dealing with writing, is that I always come back to, how do I be more direct, and how do I connect more with the feeling that's actually happening? And I think it's really fun to have writing that is made actually of the body. Yeah. So that is the presentation part. I have some kind of questions to think about.
I was just going to say, I don't have a question right now, but I really loved your presentation and the graphics and the way you, I don't know, it was really lovely to hear and see. And your art and the different artists you shared, it's really, really, like, lots of beautiful work.
Oh, thank you. I saw Elspeth's comment as well in the chat. Yeah, I wanted to draw from a lot of different places, because my work obviously does go quite a lot of different places, and I feel like it's always more interesting to kind of bring in things from different places that you might not necessarily see all at once when you're talking about something quite big.
Can I ask, have you ever sort of like experienced like such strong like reaction to text in relation to the tattoo piece that because that was like probably like a very like bodily, like intense feeling, right? Has text ever sort of like elicited like such a strong response outside of that?
Like, so I'm the viewer, and then I'm looking at some other text, and then that has made me feel very strongly.
I suppose so, yeah.
That's tricky. I mean, because it's so everywhere, it's very hard to just like go through in my head like all of the times I've seen words, because it's every second of every day, So, I mean, honestly, like, kind of in a positive way, I've been very, very moved by Jenny Holz's work and Bruce Naumann's work when I've seen it in person. I think it's really important, and it's not kind of, and that's why I brought them into the presentation, because I feel like they're people who do kind of elicit that reaction for me in a positive way. Honestly, I really don't like Barbara Kruger's work, and that's a bit confrontational. Some people really love Barbara Kruger, but it's not for me. But I don't know. I'm struggling to think of a relevant answer to your question, unfortunately, because I'm finding it very hard to look through like my memory and find things that might be relevant, just purely because it's so everything. Elspeth has asked what I don't like about Barbara Kruger's work. I think it's the form that it's presented in. I find it quite overwhelming. And I think it's difficult to engage in, because it's so overwhelming kind of spatially. So if people who don't know, Barbara Kruger does like huge installations which take up the whole room with text, and I find it very intense, actually, and confrontational. So maybe that is something for your answer, Angel.
I have like a question. Yeah, I've never heard of Amandine Alessandra's work. And yeah, just thinking about how like this is this like a form of like writing dance? I don't know. It's and yeah, I don't know if you wanted to elaborate on that a bit more on a
Yeah, so this is actually a suggestion that was made by a friend when I mentioned that I was doing this topic. So I'm not super familiar myself, but I was very glad to be introduced to the work. They do have a full website which goes into their projects, which I will see if I can dig up and get that sent to you. But yeah, so the especially the one with the M where it's like the long exposure. So they did a whole alphabet, I think, of long exposure photographs, where it was about the movement of creating the letter with their hands. So that definitely does have like a dynamic element to it, and I feel like is very closely related to dance in that way. I can see Elspeth has their hand up.
Hi. Yeah, I was just going to ask. I really loved all the artists you showed us, so thank you so much, and it was really interesting. I'm a bit ill, so I hope this question makes sense and let me know if it doesn't. But I was wondering if you sometimes feel like artists use text in their work in a way that maybe isn't like as considered when they just really want to like make a statement, but they haven't found like the medium to do that in, like if they're not an artist who necessarily always works with text, or like they kind of feel like not as confident in what they're trying to say. I'm thinking of maybe things like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's dress, which said "tax the rich" at the Met Gala, like, which I felt like there was a lot of conversation about. I hope that makes sense, and I really like love artists that work with text. So it's not meant to be like saying that, but do you know what I mean? Like, I wonder if sometimes you think that like some artists come to it who don't like consider it as much, and they're just like, I really want to say this thing, so they don't think about it as much. Does that make sense? It just made me, what you were saying about Barbara Kruger's work as well, it just made me think about it, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe that for me, it just doesn't hit on the part that I'm interested in, which is usually the kind of the context of it all talking together. And then I think sometimes you're right that if someone just has an idea that they really want to get out, sometimes they will just write it really big and then be like, that's an outcome, and I've processed the idea and now it's out in the world. And maybe it's just that I'm not necessarily as interested in that idea when it's kind of portrayed so almost simplistically, where it's but I think, you know, there's always going to be pieces that are more successful and less successful from artists that do work with text. I mean, there's so many Jenny Holzer pieces that I don't necessarily connect with, that I don't necessarily like, because I feel like maybe they are a bit on that road of kind of being maybe a little bit too simplistic or a little bit too obvious. There's something about kind of being obvious there, which is difficult to kind of reconcile, you know. But I think that is part of the process of the making of the art, is like working out what's successful and what's not. And I mean, there are some artists that I don't have the names of in my head right now, but I can picture their work where it almost feels lazy. I think that's the thing that is upsetting, is when it feels lazy, when it feels like it's been applied as an excuse to not go further into the idea, and not because it actually gives anything to the idea itself. Does that go some way to answering your question?
Yeah, no, it really does. That was such a good answer. Thank you so much.
Great. Saskia, I'm reading your message about feeling overwhelmed with all of the text in your room. Oh, don't freak out. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how it's something that I feel like once you kind of see it, you never really unsee it. I feel it's something for me that I've seen and always been interested in seeing. But I know a lot of people don't have that relationship with text, and yeah, it's very interesting to talk about that perspective. Yeah, Pooja?
Hi, sorry. Hi. Yeah, first of all, again, thank you so much for this. I find this so interesting, especially thinking of like the texture of texts, if that makes sense, like how you kind of describe the way things move. Something I tend to struggle with is that I think in like writing or like journalistic writing, there's kind of a responsibility of the writer to make what you're saying really understandable to the reader, right? Like there's like it has to follow a certain like structure so that people can grasp what you're trying to say. And I find that it really difficult to hold that while also playing with this really experimental idea of language and text, where like one word, like a word can mean anything, or, you know, like it's holding those two thoughts in the same space for me is so difficult, which is, I think, one of the bigger like joyful challenges of this course, is like trying to figure out how to do both at the same time. But I was just wondering if you had anything to say to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a conversation I've been having with some of my friends more broadly, about kind of this notion of like access and what it means for access to be equitable without it being kind of oversimplistic, and how you address that more broadly. And it's such a huge conversation, and it's such a huge question, because you have to think about what your kind of role is in that context. Like, are you there to explicitly go through what has happened in the clearest way that the most people will be able to get something out of? Or are you speaking to a specific audience that is already maybe interested in something in a certain way, or already educated in something in a certain way, and will be able to get the more kind of experimental outcome that you would be kind of hoping for when you were writing that piece? And I think it just really depends on context, like absolutely so much. And yeah, it's such a difficult question, and it is something that I'm always wrestling with myself, because I mean, for a long time before I was writing, I do a lot of writing in my work now, and I do a lot of writing. I'm also doing an MA, so I'm writing academically as well. So when I'm doing that writing, I have to write in such a different way. I used to be like, oh, I never use capital letters, and it's stylistic and it's a choice and it's how I'm deciding to write. And then I suddenly was in a situation where that was not possible anymore, and it started to change how I was thinking about things. And the thing that I'm always most wary about is kind of letting the institutional wants get into my thought processes. So like trying to identify where I feel that friction, and making sure that I kind of make space to write in the way that I want to write, and it doesn't start changing how I think about writing necessarily, because I do feel that kind of the push and pull to other areas of my practice, kind of coming from the more academic, like work-based writing as well. Yeah, it's a very tricky question though. It's kind of like you have to sit with that problem, I think. Yeah, hand up.
Oops. Okay. Hi. I don't really know where I'm going with this, but a part of my practice is really interested in like fandom as a practice, and like internet fans on the internet. And I feel like I resonated with loads of like bits and pieces of what you were saying throughout your whole presentation. And I think in my practice, I found it hard to like sort of transfer like internet fandoming cultures that are like mostly like text based or like more visual arts based into like my movement practice. And I mean, something that you said sort of like clarified that a little bit for me, the bit about like the gestural act of writing. But then also there is like a difference between like typing and like, you know, physically writing on a piece of paper. So I was just thinking like, do you have any thoughts about like text, specifically like text on the internet or like on a computer?
Yeah, I mean, internet text gets so messy because it's also this kind of more immediate way of conversing that we've never really had archived in the way that it is now. So we have these archives of instant chat conversations that if they were happening in person, you would never have a recording of, you would never be able to refer back to. And it's a very kind of different thing where we almost feel like it's happening transiently, but actually it's creating this kind of permanent like image after itself. And I always think that's so interesting about text on the internet, and also the way that there is have you read Because Internet by Gretchen McCulloch? You should really read that. It's about kind of how language has changed on the internet basically, and all the different ways that like there are like internet dialects almost of how people use written language, and punctuation especially. Like, so when people will capitalize the starts of words for emphasis and then not capitalize anything else, which is very much how I write naturally, and how this is developed through kind of instant messaging and through chat rooms and things like that. So I mean, it's super interesting. It's very different to writing with your hand. You're absolutely right there. It's so different to that kind of gestural motion. And it's interesting because also you're interfacing with something that is so consistent and so like measured. Like the keyboard is like, you know, if you're going to press T, it's the same every time. Like it's not like you can write it in different ways. So it's interesting how that limits it, in terms of if you were going to think about like the gestures of typing, it's very closed and very small and very like kind of always the same. And that's also not really a whole thought either, but you know, it's related to what we were saying. Oh, the chat is happening so much. Thank you, Angel.
No worries. I just actually found the book in my library. I've had it for like a year now and I haven't read it. So
Yes, it's so good.
yeah. A little nudge.
Oh, so it was just about the book. Okay, I was just catching up with the chat. Sophie?
Hi, Anna. I was just a bit interested in how maybe your process comes about as you're like starting to create a new piece, or like what's your starting point, or what's like your first like inspirations, or what do you like see and roll with, or what do you like initiate, or yeah.
That's such a difficult question, because I don't know if I can even point to one thing. Because I work with so many different mediums in my practice. Like, I don't just make visual art or sculpture or things like that. And I know that a lot of the things that I pulled out in this were because that's kind of where text tends to go. But usually I will have an idea that is kind of just burning a hole in my brain, and then I'll just think about it an awful lot and think about what is most suitable for that idea. So it might be I want to do a piece of writing about it. It might be that I feel like there's a performance in it. So I've done like some performance poetry and things before, and sometimes some I also do kind of improvised music performances as well, which are about kind of the connection and communication between the people performing. So it's and the ideas that stick in my brain are usually around the same kind of things. So this was let me see if I can yeah, so it's around these kind of ideas, and that's usually where I get stuck on something. Or and honestly, now as I move into a more kind of professionalized way of looking at my practice, it's, well, what is there a brief that is appropriate? Is there a fund that is appropriate? Is there a commission that is appropriate for some of the ideas that I'm already working with? And then I will be like, okay, well, how does this idea translate into a work? And sometimes it is literally just about making a decision about what best fits that idea, or making a decision to kind of not make a decision and make a piece of work that is quite expanded. So it might be like a piece of writing that is also performed, or that is also exists in some other way. So does that help?
Yeah, that's yeah, really interesting. Also, like, for instance, in some of your work where you had like hands and it said revere, and it had what was on your coat again?
Participate.
Like, for instance, because those are quite like singular, they're obviously like one word things. How do you settle on them? Or like, do you say, is it like something which just kind of is in your brain already?
It's kind of intuitive, and it's also kind of about just committing. Like, it's just saying like, well, this is the one that I've chosen, and this does this, and that's what this is going to be now. And kind of not worrying too much about like, oh, well, what if it did something else? What if it was this other word that did something else? It's like, well, yeah, then that would be a different work. So I think it's kind of about making the decision and then just being okay with the decision that you made, more than anything else.
Yeah, that's fab. Thank you.
How's everyone feeling?
I wonder if now is a good time to maybe take our 10-minute break. And we can also like end the session, like, or the group discussion a bit early, because I have some other stuff that I want to bring up to the group. So
sure.
Cool. See you all
Thank you.
5 to 7.